Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Selina Jaffrey, and I'm the Director of Business and Policy at Asia Society Texas Center. Tonight's program is on the topic of examining U.S. dependency on China in the global medical supply chain. Our speaker is Rosemary Gibson, who is the author of China RX, Exposing the Risks of America's Dependence on China for Medicine. She also serves as the Senior Advisor at the Hastings Center. She's a recipient of the American Medical Writers Association Award for her contributions in reporting on critical healthcare issues. Our moderator is Chris Tomlinson. He's a business columnist with the Houston Chronicle, where he writes commentary on business, energy, and economics. Before we get started, I would like to share that Asia Society Texas Center is an educational institution promoting cultural exchange to celebrate diversity and foster a better understanding of our interconnected world. Because we believe in the importance of having access to diverse communities and perspectives, many of Asia Society's programs, like this one, are free. Please consider supporting our work through a tax-deductible gift by texting Asia Society TX to 243725. We hope you enjoy the program. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here and to have a great conversation with Rosemary Gibson about perhaps one of the most important things that we as a nation need to think about in this, not only in this time of pandemic, but as we look forward to the future of our nation and the future of our healthcare system, and how we're going to make sure that we have access to the materials and the medicines that are necessary to keep us healthy and to keep our family and our children healthy. You know, from 2010 to 2019, the rate of pharmaceutical imports to the U.S. more than doubled. And most of that doubling came from moving manufacturing out of the United States, out of Europe, out of Canada and Japan, and moving it to China. And that manufacturing moved there for the same reasons as all manufacturing moved, because it was more affordable and it made more sense. Today, about 80% of the heparin that is consumed in the United States, that's a blood thinner, an anticoagulant that is used by a lot of heart patients to stay alive, comes from China. About 70% of the acetaminophen, the basic Tylenol, comes from China. And when the pandemic hit, we discovered that much of our PPE, much of our testing kits, and so many more of the products that we would come to need, we relied on from China. And so the question is, you know, is this a good idea? Is this something that's sustainable? Is this something we need to do something about? Well, long before any of us ever thought about COVID, or almost very few of us even wondered where our pharmaceuticals came from, Rosemary Gibson was working on her book, China RX, which came out 2 years ago. And she identified these problems. She identified that pharmaceuticals are our third largest import, only behind cars and crude oil. And so I'm really excited to talk to Rosemary about her book, what she learned in doing that research, and her observations since the pandemic, and of course, what will come next, or what we should consider doing next. So thank you, Rosemary, for joining us.
Chris, it's great to be with you. Thank you so much, and to the Asia Society Texas Center for having me.
So I want to get right into it. I also, though, want to remind our viewers that I'm only going to ask some of the questions questions, I'm going to have to hand that off to you before too long. So if there's anything you'd like to know, any questions that you have, please use the question and answer or the comment box, depending on which medium you're watching us on. And those messages will get to me, and I'm happy to pass them on to Rosemary later in the show. So, Rosemary, you mentioned that during the 1990s, about 90% of the global supply of key medicine ingredients were produced in America, Europe, and Japan. And today, 80% are produced in China. Can you expand a little bit on what exactly happened and why?
Sure. There was a dramatic shift, as you say, Chris, in where the key ingredients to make our medicines. So say if you take an aspirin, you've probably heard of acetyl salicylic acid. That's the key ingredient we're talking about. Or if you take a vitamin C, ascorbic acid is that key ingredient. It's what makes our medicine medicine. Well, when I was writing China RX, I was stunned to put pieces together and realized that we began to see a huge sea change beginning a little after the year 2000. And that's when the US-China trade deal was signed and China came into the World Trade Organization. And I documented and reported in China RX that within 2 or 3 years, that's when the last aspirin plant closed in the United States. We cannot make aspirin here. It's when the last vitamin C plant closed. We can't make vitamin C here either. It's when our last penicillin plant closed. And we don't make any antibiotics here in the United States. It's really quite remarkable. These are medicines that are needed, that you take for bronchitis or pneumonia or strep throat, or you give to your children for ear infections. So that the China trade deal really had an impact. And that's when we started importing the material to make heparin, the blood thinner you talked about. That happened around that time. So that was one of the big factors that prompted offshoring to China.
And was this purely an economic decision by the pharmaceutical companies? Is it just as simple as, they can make it cheaper over there?
Chris, one of the stories that we uncovered in China RX was really the deeper story behind, so why did the last penicillin plant close in 2004? It was in upstate New York. It was owned by Bristol Myers Squibb. This was a plant that one time made 70% of the world's penicillin. So it was a giant complex. And thanks to great people from Europe who shared some data with me, it turns out there's a real story behind it. And it's much more than just lower costs in China. They have data showing that China did a very smart thing, a very strategic move as part of its industrial policy in the late 90s and beyond. They invested heavily in making antibiotics. Any country needs antibiotics. And if you're in a large country with 1.3 billion people, it makes a lot of sense to produce your own. But what we saw was very clear evidence of cartels and price fixing and dumping product on the global market at below market prices to drive out competition. And that's what happened. We have evidence of where the price dropped globally, kept low for several years. And that's when the last US penicillin plant closed. And even the last India can't make basic antibiotics. It depends on China. And so when I testified before Congress, a member of Congress asked, so what's the real story here? I say what's happening is US companies and companies in Europe and India and elsewhere, they're not competing with Chinese companies. They're really competing with the Chinese government, because the government there subsidizes its industry as part of its state capitalism. So it's more than just lower costs. There's a lot more to the story of how it is that we became, not just the US, but the world, so dependent on a single country.
Well, and that really surprises me, particularly since most of this happened, I mean, after the 9/11 terror attacks, we were all very concerned about making sure that we had strategic stockpiles of things like antibiotics that would help protect ourselves against, say, a biological weapon. Um, did no one notice as all these factories shut down?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when the China RX came out, someone asked me, so why did it take someone like you to report this? How come we didn't know? And just a quick factoid about the anthrax attacks. When they occurred in Washington and the Senate office buildings in New York and media organizations, post offices, and elsewhere around the country, the US government went to buy millions of doses of a really important antibiotic as an antidote to anthrax exposure. And it had to turn to a company in Europe that in turn had to buy the key ingredient from a plant in China. So this was going on for some time. And it really is quite remarkable that this was not brought to the attention of people from a biodefense perspective. But at least now with China RX, which has exposed it, it's now garnered the attention that it deserves. But we have a lot of catch up to do, as do countries in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere, because we'll get to this in a few minutes. Because of coronavirus and the pandemic, we're seeing the consequences of a centralized global supply chain in a single country and the challenges that brings to countries' public health and their health security.
Well, I mean, that's exactly where I think we need to go next, because in a way, we did have a biological crisis. It wasn't a weapon, it was a virus, and was a virus that swept the world, from one country to the next. And we were one of the last ones hit. And I think that's possibly one of the reasons why we struggled to get the stuff that we needed. Can you talk a little bit about what COVID has demonstrated?
Sure. Well, I think that thanks to good reporting, we've heard, and many of us the world has come to understand that it started in China, and China wanted to ensure it had enough masks and gloves and gowns and certainly medicines to care for its own people. And it's clear that there were U.S. plants there making PPE, and their product was nationalized. It was on ships ready to come to the U.S. and to customers, but those ships were turned around and they had to keep that product in China. And that was a signal that maybe we need to have some of our own domestic capability, because countries will keep product for their own people. And as the virus spread to more than 100 countries, we saw most of them banned exports of PPE and essential drugs. They were keeping them for their own. And so behind the scenes, we heard a lot about shortages of masks, shortages of testing kits and gowns, and also problems with those products. Testing kits giving improper results, gowns that were contaminated with bacteria, gowns meant for operating rooms, masks that did not protect healthcare workers or the public. And so there was a concern about supply, but also quality of products. We had transportation shutdowns that caused shortages, and people were scrambling. But behind the scenes, and what wasn't reported, was the scrambling going on to make the core components to our essential drugs. Think of it, you have 100 countries with people who are very sick. They're hospitalized and they need bread and butter medicines. These are generics. They're the medicines that if you go into a hospital today, or if you go to a drugstore, they're 90% of the medicines that we'll get. And we had the world competing for a limited supply of those core medicines and the ingredients to make them. And so there have been shortages dramatic shortages and rationing here in the United States and other countries of critical drugs. So we clearly had a wake-up call, and now we're seeing countries begin to regroup, rethink, and look at their supply chains and come up with a different approach to them.
And it's not just us, right? Because I know when I lived in Africa and worked there, most of the pharmaceuticals that we received were made in India. They were generics. And we now learn that 80% of the precursors, like the basic building blocks that India uses to make those drugs, also come from China. So even one of the world's largest pharmaceutical manufacturing nations is still dependent on China. That's how, can you elaborate a little bit on how it's not just the manufactured product, it's also the chemicals you need to make the product.
That's right. One of the big jaw droppers for me while researching China RX was how even India's military depends on China for the ingredients in basic medicines like antibiotics. And as you mentioned, India has a huge generic drug industry, but it would shut down within months if China stopped sending those core ingredients. And we began to see some of that happening just because of supply and limited supply and global demand. And that's why India had to ban exports of critical drugs, in part because it didn't have enough product to make them and because it wanted to preserve them for its own people. So it's the equivalent would be having the strategic petroleum reserve, have 90% of the world's oil come from a single country. And the event of a natural disaster or a Fukushima type event, that would send the world it would just stop the world's economies. So we have something similar with essential drugs to run our healthcare systems around the world. And that has captured the attention of a lot of people. And we really need to rethink and diversify our manufacturing base here. Japan is considering this. They're meeting with their domestic companies. European companies are doing the same. India is, and here in the United States as well. It's just a smart thing to do, not put all of our eggs in one basket, but to diversify.
We know the Senate has proposed $100 million of federal funding to encourage more precursor manufacturing and pharmaceutical manufacturing within the United States. We saw the $765 million contract with Kodak, which was rushed, and now it's up in the air, and there's some questions about whether or not that's going to happen. And let's face it, most of these drugs are made from petroleum, from oil and natural gas and stuff that we're producing here in Texas. How big of a challenge is it to make affordable drugs in a developed country like the United States?
Chris, it really is possible to make affordable generic drugs here in the United States. And there's 2 points here to talk about this. One is we have incredible technology and innovation in pharmaceutical manufacturing called advanced manufacturing or continuous processes. And that has not been used for the production of these generic drugs. And that's in part because the margins are very slim. We have an opportunity to use that technology to make these basically commodity products faster, cheaper, with a smaller environmental footprint. And equally important is real-time quality control. Because when you lose control over the supply of your medicines, we also lose control over the quality of them. And some of your viewers might remember the huge recall of blood pressure medicines that began in 2018. There were carcinogens in them. And a Chinese company was one of the biggest global suppliers. And it had the highest level of carcinogen, more than 200 times the acceptable limit per pill. and the FDA missed it for lots of reasons. So we need real-time quality control that doesn't rely on inspecting plants, 8,000 miles away. So we have technology here that can help us make them cheaper. But here's something else that might be of interest to your listeners that I've learned in this work. I spoke to a gentleman who makes pharmaceuticals. He's been doing it for more than 30 years. And he went to buy a 90-day supply of generic blood pressure medicine for himself, went to a retail store. And for this 90-day supply, it was $157.50. And he says, guess how much the manufacturer would be paid for that? I had no idea, maybe $10. He said the manufacturer would be paid $1. He said, I know because I'm in the business. So the question is, where does all the rest of that money go? $156.50. So the price that we pay for our generic drugs and even our branded products, a very small sliver of it goes to the manufacturer. And remember, with generics, there isn't any R&D. Other people in between here, this is what needs some good investigative journalism, to find out where that money goes and how can we extract value from that and put more of that money into good manufacturing, quality manufacturing, and giving higher value to people who are struggling to pay for their generic drugs.
Well, and this gets to perhaps the biggest problem with the US healthcare system is that every contract is secret, right? I mean, they claim that whatever price they negotiate is proprietary information, it's a trade secret. And so while we know that, say, that tablet costs a penny to come off in raw materials, how is it worth $30,000 by the time it reaches, say, the cancer patient who really needs it?
You're absolutely right. And I'm heartened also by another innovation that we've seen in this space. There was a nonprofit organization started by the Mayo Clinic and a number of other healthcare systems. Maybe there are some in Texas that are part of it. The nonprofit is called Civica RX. And their member hospitals were tired of perennial drug shortages. We used to have 200 to 300 drugs in shortage at any one time in the United States. This was before coronavirus. And we could have a whole segment on that, on the reasons for that. And so these hospitals got together, chipped in some money, and they did something very simple you would do when we would have a shortage of anything else. They say, we're going to find trustworthy manufacturers. We're going to pay them a fair price, fully transparent. We're going to give them long-term contracts so they can invest in their manufacturing facilities and have backup just in case something goes down. And we're going to know where it comes from and who's making them. And we're going to be inspecting those plants. And we will have the products tested. Most people think FDA is testing it. Well, they're not. And within 2 years, they just celebrated their second anniversary. Within 2 years, Chris, they've delivered 40 different drugs to their member hospitals that were in shortage. And these are life-saving medicines. So when COVID hit, their hospitals were fine. So it's about using our procurement dollars to, frankly, demand a better quality product and no shortages. And we're demonstrating that it's absolutely feasible to do this and really the right thing to do for our health security, for patients, for doctors, those who care for them, and for really our national security. So I hope that we see more innovations like that in how we purchase. And Kaiser Permanente, with 12 million members, they just joined Civica this summer. So there's really, people are rethinking what they purchase, how they purchase it, and wanting to invest in trustworthy manufacturing and really putting more money there rather than all these, non-transparent things. And the other thing I like, this shouldn't be innovative, but it is. During testimony on Capitol Hill in June, this nonprofit group had told Congress, here's where our finished drugs are made, and here's where the active ingredient is made. That's revolutionary. It shouldn't be, but it is. But this is what we can do when we come together to look for common sense solutions around a very serious problem. And great things can happen.
So I should start looking for a made in America or made in USA label on my Tylenol bottle. Is that going to be part of the solution?
I think there's growing public interest in wanting to know, where is this made? It's not just our medicine, but our glucose monitoring strips, our thermometers. I think people want to have trust, and they want to have things made in places that, they know where it's being made, and somebody's putting their name on the box that they can trust.
Well, before, the China-US relations began to sour, it seemed like a good deal. China was making a quality product. They were making it inexpensively by outsourcing that manufacturing and importing it to the United States. We were saving money. That was the globalist dream. And I dare say I am a globalist. I believe in, if another country can make it cheaper, better, faster, then why not, take advantage of that? How much of this is just nasty nationalism? And, and is there anything fundamentally wrong with outsourcing medications?
Another jaw dropper, Chris, while working on China RX, is that, here in the US, growing up, we were used to having, companies here make things. We had a Food and Drug Administration that assured the quality of our medicines. We never questioned them before. And these are not like, sneakers or computers. These are products that have to be made a certain way to ensure their safety and their quality. What was shocking is we outsourced production of essential drugs to a country that it did not have any regulatory system to speak of in 2007 and 2008. The head of the FDA counterpart in China, it really wasn't a counterpart. It was just at a very early stage of protecting the public. The head of the Chinese FDA was executed for taking bribes. I start off China RX with a story of a Johns Hopkins trained doctor who walked into a very famous hospital in this country. He got contaminated heparin. And within 11 minutes of getting it, he went into complete heart failure and multiple organ failure because there was a lethal contaminant put into it. This was, again, after we opened up free trade with China and began to source it there. So the quality problems were absolutely profound, and hundreds of Americans died. So what was shocking is how we outsourced product to a country that didn't have anywhere near the regulatory system in place that we've counted on. The United States created this gold standard. It's a very complex thing to make a drug, a pill, a vial of medicine, and get it right. Every vial, every pill, every time. And China, it's through no fault. They were just an earlier stage of development, and we had shocking problems of quality. And there was no FDA inspections in these plants to speak of. And there were hearings on Capitol Hill, and nothing happened. But as someone said, well, we finally had, quote, a body count. This is what it took for reform to get FDA inspectors in China beginning in 2012. But now with coronavirus, there's no FDA inspectors there. They were recalled for their own health security. And as a consequence, there's nobody in there inspecting plants there or any other countries around the world. And I think we're going to see the beginning of the end of the FDA's ability to protect the American people. There's a really interesting chapter in China RX about chicken, and I debated about whether or not to put it in there. But it's in there because there were a lot of forces, Democrat and Republican side, to import chicken from China. Well, when we buy chicken here from the US, you have USDA inspectors in those plants. If we import chicken from China, there'll be no USDA inspectors in those plants. US consumers will be relying on an entity, a Chinese government agency, to basically assure the quality of the chicken. So we've seen a dramatic reduction in the regulatory system we've had to protect the American people. Same with organic certification. Used to be a US-based company designated by the Department of Agriculture to go to countries, including China, to ensure they were meeting US organic standards. Though that's gone, and now it's an entity of the Chinese government that is reviewing organic certification. And, you know, a lot of Americans remember when thousands of dogs and cats died in this country because of an industrial chemical put in pet food sold here in this country. That was the same time that we began outsourcing all this stuff. So we have a long way to go to ensure quality. And when it comes to our medicines, you know, trust is everything.
So just a reminder to our viewers, I do want to get you involved in this conversation. So please send us your questions. I've got one more for Rosemary, and then I'm going to move on to those. And I guess, you know, the well, actually, you anticipate my question with this conversation about the FDA.
Sure.
You're a step ahead of me. So I think I'm going to jump ahead to Sage's question, which is, you know, is the U.S. capable of moving the chemical, the molecule production back here, or is it better to have that distributed in other countries? You know, because there are economies of scale. Are there countries that we can trust? Is there a mix to this?
Sure, there certainly are other countries that we can trust and work with. But once again, with the global pandemic, when countries ban exports, then we may not be able to get what we need. And if you think about it, we have a country with 340 million people. And so that's a huge market. And we can begin to identify, you know, places like Kodak. Perhaps that will get off the ground or not. I hope it does. That has huge chemical capability, and it can be restarted. And if we see more demand for, again, a basic level, we don't have to make every drug here. It's just about having those essential drugs you need to run a healthcare system, the ones you need in ICUs and EDs, the ones you need for the strategic national stockpile. They probably should be made here. So yes, we have that capability here. We have to turn it on, but they need customers to make finished drugs here. So it's going to take a while to get the machine moving, to get things going. Let's have demand for domestic finished drugs, and that will create demand for the chemical precursor material to make them.
And is there, are you aware, because this is a question from Pat,
Sure.
and Pat is asking, you know, are there any emerging technologies that can make it easier or cheaper to restart manufacturing? Is there like a leap in robotics or, you know, something that we can do to be even better than the plants in China?
Sure. We can, as I mentioned earlier, advanced manufacturing, continuous process is used in the chemical industry. It has only been rarely used for pharmaceuticals. And you're right, pharmaceuticals is basically a chemical industry. And so there can be investments made in that advanced manufacturing technology. It was developed at MIT. But let's keep that let's use that application here in this country to solve a problem. It's very promising, and there have been some investments by the federal government in advanced manufacturing to produce product here, and we can make it end to end. And it takes brilliant chemistry, and we have brilliant chemists in this country. And so that work is getting underway. It's very, very exciting.
You know, Houston, I mean, it was interesting that you brought up CivicRx because, you know, the John Arnold Foundation here in Houston is supporting that. Houston obviously has a lot of research, medical research here. I go in and I talk to people all the time about the new molecule they're testing and its potential. But one of the questions I always have to ask is, how expensive is this drug going to be? Right now the pressure is on to bring down prices. I have a question here about, Rosemary, do you see prices going even higher if the global medical supply chain is diversified?
For the generic drugs, which are the bread and butter drugs that most of us take when we go to the hospital or go to the pharmacy to fill a prescription. And costs it doesn't have to be an explosion in healthcare costs if they're made here in the United States. The one thing I'll say is that I think there are a lot of people that would love to get into this business and make a lot of money. And what I tell them is, and this is my personal view, we should view this as like a public utility. These are things that everybody may need at some point, or at least you want to know that they're there just in case, like antibiotics if you go into an emergency room, or you need heparin if you're, God forbid, in an accident on the interstate. That some of these they're almost like public goods. Again, these are essential drugs we need.
And you can make the same argument for healthcare writ large, all aspects of it.
Oh, well, sure. But these are products that, we can actually tell what it costs to produce. And I've said this when I've testified before Congress. I'd like to see companies that are producing product for the federal government to have transparency on what their production costs are. And then to give them, a certain, whatever percentage on top of that to cover their investment costs. I'd like to see that transparency. We should expect the transparency on where product is made. And we need to have these products tested. And that doesn't cost that much to do. So I think we have a chance to really transform the market if we have market demand for a better quality product and we know who's making it. And we can make it here faster and cheaper.
So Tabs wants to open up a big can of worms and is asking about the role of multilateral organizations like the G20, WTO, APEC. Pharmaceuticals has traditionally been one of the biggest stumbling blocks in trade negotiations, and we've been renegotiating a lot of trade deals. We have a lot of new trade deals on the table. What role do they play in all of this?
Chris, when I worked on China RX, I really stayed in the generic space. I didn't deal with the patented products because there weren't the same supply chain problem. They're not nearly the same supply chain problems as there are for the bread and butter medicines we need to survive. So I really can't speak to that. I was focusing on those things that we need that make our healthcare systems run every day.
This doesn't have any impact. Trade deals don't have an impact on generics then?
My understanding is that where the real issues are there for the patented products, the ones where you have the intellectual property that companies want to have protected, and then what price you sell them at. That's a very distinct set marketplace and set of products.
Jeff is asking about, pharmaceuticals were produced here in the United States, but also in Puerto Rico. When the hurricane hit, we learned a lot about Puerto Rico's role in something as simple as saline IV solution. Jeff is asking, will recent events encourage Congress to revisit tax policies that encouraged companies to move overseas? Was that a part of this?
Yeah, it was quite remarkable that in the mid-90s, there been a tax break for companies producing product in Puerto Rico, but tax break began to expire in the mid-90s. That was a deliberate decision at that time. And so that really had a tremendous negatively impact on Puerto Rico and its pharmaceutical industry, which was a boon to the local economy. It had a workforce that was really terrific, and it helped contribute to Puerto Rico's prosperity. And you're right, the hurricane demonstrated not just the vulnerability, but how things deteriorate when you lose a really important segment of a production capability in a country. For the generics, to make things financially viable in Puerto Rico, I spoke to a gentleman who built a plant there, and it kept operating through Hurricane Maria. And that was because it had redundant systems, it had generators, it had plans for its workforce to get them to the plant and back. It just kept operating. But most companies didn't make that investment. And when it comes to generics, again, the margins are really slim. It's really unclear if investing in Puerto Rico will help us solve the generic issue. And it takes much more resources to have an ongoing capability that we can rely on. So that might work for certain products, perhaps branded products where they have, a higher margin. But if we're talking about the essential drugs we need to survive, does it make sense to put it in a region that is very vulnerable to hurricanes?
When you were talking about Civic RX's success with their business plan, it seemed to me that what the hospitals are doing is they're eliminating middlemen. They're going directly to the factory. They're not going through the wholesaler, the distributor, the retailer. They're not going through a PBM, a pharmaceutical benefit manager. They're not going through an insurance company. There are 5 intermediary steps between the factory where the drug is made and the doctor who puts it in your hand. Is that all it's going to take to make it just as affordable, is to get rid of some of those middlemen?
Well, I can imagine that's Amazon Pharmacy's intention, to go directly to the consumer. And to be fair and balanced, if we look at what's frankly killed generic drug manufacturing in this country, it's these very large companies that don't produce anything. They engage in transactions, some of which have value, purchasing, transportation, distribution. But there's a grave imbalance in what we pay people to make things versus all this other non-transparent world. And in my view, whenever there's a lack of transparency, there's something there to hide. So I think Civica, frankly, is a workaround a very broken system. And we need more of that. And I would encourage more hospitals to engage in that type of different procurement practices. And I'll tell you, we have to do it for more than just drugs. I'm concerned now about the hip and knee implants that are being offshored to China. Who's checking those? And what about CT scanners? If they're not here already, who's checking them? The FDA doesn't do that. Who's ensuring the quality of these products and how they're made? So we have a lot of work to do, but at least we have good people that are creating some dynamism in the marketplace to begin to fix some pretty serious problems we have.
I asked this question a little more generically, and so let me kind of drill down on this a little bit more, because we're seeing folks like Apple and Foxconn and a lot of American companies are trying to get out of China right now and find alternative locations. Moving supply chains is hard. It's challenging, and also you need to figure out where you're going to move them. We have this new USMCA agreement with Canada and Mexico. Could there be, is that close enough? Are those good enough allies, or do we really kind of need it right here within our borders?
I'd have to take a closer look at the USMCA to see what might be possible with producing product within, in Canada and Mexico. Again, we don't have to produce everything here, but we certainly want things available when we need them. And in those contexts, it'll take building a workforce. Canada has already has a workforce on some scale. It's not huge, but that certainly is a possibility. We have to look at all the options, but we also have to think about, from a health security perspective, what do we really need, like in our kitchen cabinets that you have to be able to sustain a family through a storm or something. That's how I view this for our essential drugs. And as companies rethink their supply chains, I think it's important to prioritize what's really important that you have to have. We don't need to have everything, but what is important to have. And it's heartening to see that companies are actively engaging in those conversations. They're finding out now who their suppliers are and who their suppliers are. These are really long supply chains. And just think of the cost of managing that. And so they're taking a hard look at that, and that's a good thing. And companies are making decisions that are right for them as they look ahead for the future. And I've been contacted by a number of domestic firms. They say, we have XYZ capability. Can you put us in touch with people who can, perhaps we can find a way to work together to achieve a good end for our health and healthcare. And again, that's very, very promising.
Have our politicians learned anything from COVID yet? Do you sense that, when it, probably not this year, but after the election, that we might see some change at that level?
Chris, I've been very heartened by the bipartisan interest in bringing some of our supply chains back home. Bills have been introduced, more than 50 of them, by Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate. We've seen some bills with bipartisan support, which is really heartening. There are some provisions that are better than others. And I'm honored that many members of Congress have read China RX or are familiar with it. So this is out there now, and they see it primarily as a national security issue, not just a health issue. And I think that's a good thing. Let's hope that after the election, whatever happens, that we can actually get together on something and secure the future. Because there will be another pandemic. There will be another something. And I hope that we take that a silver lining of this coronavirus is that we've learned a lot, and that we realize what it takes to make ventilators here, to have it close to home, to be able to make masks and gowns and ramp up production, and even help out other countries, our neighbors, and others around the globe who may not have that same type of manufacturing capability. That's good. Now with the economy in such a challenging situation, this is about jobs. And these would be good paying jobs for people and economic stimulus for communities.
Well, in this time of COVID, hope, unity, learning from our mistakes, really that's what we all need to be concentrating on in the months ahead as we work our way through this pandemic, and we realize that we have some work to do to fix the systems. Thank you so much, Rosemary, for joining us. This is our time. I also want to thank all of our viewers and listeners for joining us this evening. Asia Society Texas Center offers 150 public programs every year, just like this one, but also featuring arts, culture, education, current events, business, and policy. I'm so lucky that they invite me to help out with the policy discussions, because I learned so much. Many of these programs are free and made possible by the strong financial support of members and friends. We hope you will consider adding your support tonight by texting Asia Society TX, that is Asia Society TX, like Texas, to 243-725. Again, that's text Asia Society TX to 243-725 to donate. And thank you for considering doing this. Please tune in again next Thursday, September 10th at 7:30 p.m. Central Time for a discussion with Houston Methodist President and CEO, Dr. Mark Boom. He's going to be talking about the new realities and new challenges, coronavirus in the fall, because coronavirus in the summer was so much fun. Spring was delightful, and now we're going into the fall. So we have a lot to talk about. We have a lot to learn. We have some adjustments to make. And Dr. Mark Boom, who I've seen speak many times before, is definitely worth joining to hear that conversation. To learn more about upcoming webcasts through the Asia Society, you can do that through the Asia Society website. So thank you. Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you, Selena. And thank you, viewers. And I hope to see you soon. Thanks.